Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. What a great conversation. What a blessing it is to be here this morning, to be able to come into this building and gather as the Lord's people and have a class and a study and enter into our worship time. And we're so fortunate and so blessed, and it's just so great to be a part of God's family. Let's go to our Lord in prayer. Our Father and Lord, you alone are God, and we're just so thankful for that opportunity to be your family and to be called your children. We know that we need your grace and your mercy, and we're so thankful that you have given it to us and you offer it to us, and you make that same offer and promise to the whole world. And we pray for them, and that they would open their eyes and open their hearts to your love and your promise of salvation that comes through Christ. Be with us, strengthen those who need your healing and your comfort in whatever way that they do. We know that we all need such at times, and just help us to remember why we're here and that our time is short, but eternity is forever. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we are continuing our study in Christian apologetics, which has to do with defending the faith and kind of the principle of 1 Peter 3 and verse 15. Steve, I'm not sure why it's not coming up. I see it on my end on the iPad, but I guess maybe this back TV went out or something, but that's okay. So it's on behind me. So apologetics, the rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true, rationally compelling, and existentially engaging. And last time we began a new topic of really this question of, does God exist? And going back to this Time magazine article of, is God dead? And that question is ever present today, for sure. Is God real? Can we know God? And, there's a claim out there that our society and culture is progressively moving more and more atheistic or agnostic. So atheistic, just totally rejecting the premise that there is a God and that God exists, or agnostic in saying that, well, maybe there's a God, there could be a God, but if there is, and even if I accept that, well, I can't know for sure which one. There is no objective truth to base anything on. And so that's where we really sprung off of last time is, again, this question of, does God exist, and how can we prove that God does exist? And there's lots of ways that we could approach this, but when we think about it, there are really four fundamental cases to be made, arguments, if you will. And when we say argument, it's not to get in like this argument with people. It's evidence. It's like presenting your argument in a court case, so to speak. So it's testifying. It's a witness. It's again four cases for really a foundational platform for the existence of God, and that's where we left off last time. Was the first, the ontological argument. The ontological case for the existence of God. And we asked the question of, why do we even have a concept of God in the first place? Now, if we have spent our whole lives in an environment, and if you grew up believing in God and coming to worship services, and your parents were Christians and members of the faith, maybe even regardless of whatever faith that might be, if you've always had a foundation of, God is real. Maybe this question hasn't struck you or hasn't entered your mind, but it really is an interesting thought. Why do we have a concept of God in the first place? And the reason I ask that is because in the really sphere of evolution, if we evolved from simple matter and animals, right, and there is no God and we just evolved, then essentially that is the only concept that we should have, right? So why does the human mind have this concept of God? Do animals have a concept of God? We don't know. And in a sense, right, I like that answer, Allison, because, right, while I have a dog, and I think I know at times what she's wanting, and she expresses to me some of her desires, I can't really have a conversation with her, and I can't ask her questions and get a normal human-to-human response, right? And so in that sense, I think I would agree with that, and that we can't know for sure. However, what is one major difference then between the animal world and animal kingdom, if you will, versus human beings, and then this question of, do animals have a concept of God? What would be the difference?
They weren't made in the image of God.
Okay. Okay.
But maybe when your little dog looked at you and thought you were God. They're God.
Maybe in her world, yeah, at times, right?
I would go to Genesis 1:26, where God gives dominion over the fish and sea and the birds and the heaven and all the livestock to men to take care of that. So I would say that they probably don't have that same connection with God.
Okay, yeah, so Holly's pointing out in Genesis 1 where God, we're told, gave man dominion over the rest of the world and the rest of the animals. And that ties in then with the fact, and the reason is because man, the difference was made in God's image. And I like those, and expanding on that then, I'd say a fundamental difference is that we don't see animals building altars and having worship services, do we? Whereas human beings, whatever their faith is, whatever God they believe in, the history of the world, they have had some sort of offerings and altars and sacrifices to a supreme being. And so, in that sense, I think you can make a strong case that, well, we could then suggest that animals don't have a concept of God. If they do, at the very least, they're not showing it, right? So, whereas human beings, again, go and study, anthropology and study cultural history. There's almost every single culture, whatever their God was, they showed it and they expressed it. So, and I think that's important. And so, and another question is, do animals have a concept of an afterlife? And again, I think it would be a similar type question, but human beings express an understanding of and a desire for something after this life, whereas animals would suggest not so. And so again, what's the difference? Made in the image of God, man was given dominion over the animals and the rest of the world, but on a deeper level, it's that I think humans, man, woman, have an innate belief and understanding and concept of God. And the question is, where does that come from and why do we have it? Wes? Yeah, and I think that ties into then being made in the image of God, and that we do have a soul. Dana?
There is one verse, and I'll have to look it up, but it says that every man and beast will give an account of their second life for the
Okay, yeah, and that's talking about taking life, right? And that would be a little bit of a different type of case there, but we think about this idea of a soul, and then Why is it that we have this concept of God? And I do think it is connected with the soul, but let's look at a couple scriptures, okay? Romans 1:19. I think somebody touched on this last time. Romans 1 and verse 19. Okay, here Paul, of course, he begins by opening and speaking to these Christians in Rome, and he's telling them he wants to be able to come to Rome to impart some gifts to them and to establish them and to be encouraged along with them. And he says, I'm under obligation to preach the gospel to you and to Jews alike. And the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who is believing, verse 16. Okay, and then he talks about how God's righteousness is contained in the gospel message. And then verse 18, he says that conversely, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now notice, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So let me read that again. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So God has put His presence, His knowledge of Him inside of all human beings that have ever lived. And so again, you go back to the history of the world, and why then do all these cultures have a concept of God, have some system of faith and worship and sacrifice and building these, whatever it is that they build to their concept of God. Now, it may not be the God, right? Certainly many have strayed from that, and Paul goes on to talk about why that's actually happened. Because they've rejected the one true God for many man-made things, actually. And the creation rather than the Creator. Steve?
I would think that man has a certain amount of logic. If he starts thinking on the logic enough, it's going to go to like verse 20, and you start scratching your head and just search these things out.
The next verse talks about more evidence, and we'll look at that in just a moment, because that goes into then really another case, an argument for God's existence. And that's a good point. But this idea of God putting it inside of us, and talk about the soul, talk about eternity. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. That's another verse that we have up here. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3. This here, Solomon's talking about, how there's a time for everything. It's a newer Bible, and my pages are sticking. All right, Ecclesiastes 3. Again, there's a time for everything. And in verse 10, he says that I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart. Yet, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So God has set eternity in our hearts. And again, that's more of a concept of really this innate understanding of the existence of God, but also in the afterlife, as we already talked about. But it's something that God has put inside of us. So that's really a foundational place to begin. And then from there, kind of branching off to what Steve was talking about, right? So we begin, and all of us are born with God putting inside of us a sense and an understanding and a concept of a supreme being. And then so from there, then it's up to us to take that and to make a logical approach. And again, think about our definition of apologetics, right? And to find logic and to find more evidence of his existence and the one true God that there truly is, the one true Creator. But again, we are made in His image, and I think there's a lot that could be discussed regarding that, but it is that we have a soul, that we have an eternal destination, and so God has put it inside of us, where I think there is a fundamental difference between us and the animals. Any further thoughts on this case, this ontological argument or case to be made, that because we can conceive of God, and the fact that there's no greater being that we can conceive of, right? And that's an important concept when we talk about this, okay, is that there is no greater being. And there's been others throughout history, theologians and scholars who have made tweaks on this argument, but just, I guess, kind of step back and ask yourself, what is the greatest conceivable being that you can fathom in your mind? Okay? An all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, supreme creator and being. And that's God. And thus, and if there's nothing greater than that we can think of, then that really is the core of this ontological argument. That it is because we can conceive of this great and being that is something greater than ourselves, and that there is nothing that can be greater than that. And that in of itself is proof and existence of such a being. And of course, then the scriptures that we referenced and looked at tell us why we have such an understanding. Thoughts, questions on that? Nadia?
When someone who believes in evolution, there's no benefit in the survival of the fittest to have this. So in their theory, what you would ask them, well, why do we have this? And how does that fit in evolution?
Yeah, so Nadia's talking about, so an evolutionist, why would we have this concept? And they would say, well, man has just created this concept of God because maybe they lack hope, or they want to find purpose or reasoning or something of that nature. And they want, and others would make the case that, well, man has created it because it's a power structure in which many men have benefited from creating religion. And there is some truth in that, right? They distorted God, and they distorted faith, and they distorted religion, and that was spoken of last week in some cases. But okay, true religion, true faith, and a true understanding of God, undistorted, unperverted, is fundamental in thinking of, again, this question of, does God exist, and how we know about it. And it's not something that man created, it's something that God has put inside of us. And that's important for us to remember. Okay, case number 2, the cosmological argument. The cosmological case for the existence of God. What do we mean by the cosmological argument? Anybody know or want to take a shot at it? Okay. Yes, in a sense, right? So, and it does have to do with a beginning, okay? And so the cosmological case or argument is that whatever begins to exist has a cause, okay? Meaning something that caused it to exist. So anything that has ever begun to exist has a cause. The universe, we know, began to exist. There was a point in time where the universe came into existence. Some would say the Big Bang. Okay? So the case is that therefore, since the universe began to exist, it must have a cause. Something that caused it to exist. Okay? So, again, even scientists, even atheists admit that the universe had a beginning. Again, whether it's the Big Bang or whatever else they might claim it is, matter in and of itself cannot be eternal. Wolfgang?
I've had quite a few arguments, if you like, with people about the universe. And one of the things I found most effective, people who believe in the Big Bang Theory, you get them to really think about it when you ask them, okay, look at the universe, just look at our solar system, and think about the order of everything out in the universe. There's gravity, there's planets, there's something. It doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah. No, 100%. And so Wolfgang's talking about the order and the fundamental laws of the universe. And we'll touch on that in just a moment because that bleeds into really our next case to be made. And it's fundamental and it's absolutely a good point. So, but let's branch off on, again, this idea of whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. So the question then is, can we universally accept that our solar system, our world, our universe had a beginning? Okay, so the question then is, what is then the cause? So what is the cause of the universe? Again, nothing comes from nothing. Right? Things don't just magically appear out of nowhere and then expand and form into the order and the systems that we have today. So the only possible answer is that really this infinite, eternal, supreme being, something that is non-contingent upon something else for its existence. Something that exists outside of time, outside of space. Only that could create time and space. Does that make sense? So only a being, something that exists outside of that which began to exist, could create that which did then have a beginning. So, again, the only logical, going back to logic, the only logical answer is a infinite, eternal being, and we call that being God. So, is there a hand up? Dana?
It's interesting, the only place that they can go back to is the atom. So where do the atom come from?
Yeah, and okay, good point. So Dana says the only place they can go to, and maybe there's one other place, and we'll mention that in just a second, but is the atom. And so, but think about it, okay? It doesn't matter how far back you go and how minuscule you go, there still has the fundamental problem in question of, well, where did it come from? And who made it? And how did it get there? And again, the only possible answer, logical answer, is that an eternal, supreme, infinite being outside of time and space. And that's why, therefore, Genesis 1:1, right? That in the beginning, God created. So God already existed. And when I said there was another possible place they go, it is the question of what? What is an argument that they would make? Or a question they would ask? Who made God? Okay. Who made God? And it is a question that at times maybe we aren't comfortable answering. How would you answer that question, Brian? Yeah, right, and that kind of ties into this ontological case. But expand on it a little bit more, okay? And think about kind of the words, how you described that. You said, if I knew who made God, Well, but what's the key there? Yeah, right. So, okay, so to look at it in a flawed premise and thinking that God exists within time and space and that God is a created being, right? And so it's an understanding of that God is eternal and that God did not begin to exist. And there's many people who've spoken on this who know much more and can describe it much more eloquently than I can. And but the case is really that it's the people who ask this question are doing so from they're already starting in a flawed place. And that is that they're starting again from a place that really has an unfortunate understanding of who God is and what God is. And that is that he does not and never has been contingent upon something else for his existence. And in fact, we've already mentioned it, right? But okay, we talk about contingency. It's meaning you're dependent upon something else for your existence or your survival. And when we think about everything in this universe, because it had a beginning, all of us included, we're contingent upon something else. Well, in order for all these contingent elements to exist, there must be a non-contingent element that exists as well, and that is God. And so God exists outside of time and space and contingency.
God himself said, I am.
Exactly. And that is, okay, so Exodus 3:14, and then, all the other places that talk about it, and then Jesus making that same statement, and even before Abraham was, I am. And John 1:1, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? He was in the beginning with God, and He is God, and He's always existed, even before He became Jesus and became flesh and dwelt among us. And the very next verse there says that all things that have come into being, all things, and nothing that has ever come into being has come into existence outside of this eternal Word. Okay, and that's in the Greek, it's the Logos. And I like using that reference because in the Greek mind and in the first culture, that concept of the Logos was this supreme being and kind of this ontological type of an understanding. Okay? And that's where John goes because he's trying to make the argument to the pagan Greek culture there in his gospel. Brian? Yeah. Sure, yeah, and because he is that eternal being, right? We believe, and then so much wrapped up in what belief and faith and trust and obedience, really is. But yeah, he is the eternal one, the I am. And that's what he means by that. I have always existed, right? I am the first and the last. He is the Alpha and the Omega, and that's encompassing this concept of eternal, his eternal nature. Another hand, John? You're over here today.
But everybody has to have faith. Whether it's atheist or anybody that believes in God or believes, have got to have faith in it. It just makes no sense to have faith how God is playing versus having faith that this happened in this Big Bang Theory or whatever the person believes. Everybody has to start believe that something came from nothing. You got to have that faith to agree with that no matter what side of the fence you're on.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, and in fact, very strong case can be made that really It would take more faith to believe in evolution than a God. And going back to logic, right? And with that, three key questions that have to be asked when we think about this idea of contingency and non-contingency, right, in the universe. And one is the universe eternal? Meaning, has it always existed? Okay, because there are just three logical questions and possibilities, okay, when we talk about the universe and the cosmological argument for its existence, okay? First is it eternal? Has it always existed? Okay? And by and large, scientists make the case that no, it had a beginning. And you know, Steve touched on this last week, but true science, right, proves, it demands testability, repeatability. And so when we talk about the Big Bang and trying to find the origin of the universe, well, you can't test that. You can't repeat that. And so, truthfully speaking, it's not based on, hard science, right? It's based on a lot of faith. And so is it eternal? Or, second, did the universe create itself out of nothing? Okay? So if it's not eternal and it had a beginning, well, maybe it just created itself out of nothing. When was the last time you saw something create itself out of nothing? Doesn't happen. I've heard of it. Yeah, I haven't seen it. Yeah, I'm sure it's good. I'd like to take it because it does take a lot of faith, right? And the third, most logical, was the universe created? Okay, and again, this goes back to then, well, if it had a beginning, then logically there must be something that existed outside of time and space then to create time and space. Thoughts, questions on this? Any further comments? Nadia? Yeah. Yeah, God is eternal, right? God is spiritual, and that a little bit goes back to, again, being made in the image of God and so on. So, okay, case number three, argument number three is the teleological argument. Teleological argument, okay? And this has to go with really a bit of an expansion on what Wolfgang was talking about. And this is the design evidence that is everywhere in our universe. Everywhere. In so many different ways, whether it's the laws of the universe or the structure or just the amazing, innate, artistic proof of a creator from the animal kingdom or the cosmos or whatever it is, right? Well, last night we were talking about men and women going into space and going to the moon and going to Mars and thinking about those amazing things. And again, it's everywhere. And again, the question is why and what does it mean? This undeniable design evidence everywhere. So there are, in the universe, again, solar systems, galaxies, stars, in our own bodies. The human body is a truly incredible creation. It is remarkable, how designed we are, how intricate our bodies are and our systems are, and it's amazing. Anybody had ever heard the Paley's watchmaker analogy? So just imagine you're walking down St. Augustine Beach and you come across a pocket watch from however many years ago. Or it could even be a new watch, one that's not not digital, but even if it was digital, right? Because those are amazing in and of themselves. But this watch, and you open it up, and you see this. Look at how fine-tuned and amazing all these different parts and how they all go together, and what would be, so if you found this, what would you logically conclude about where it came from? Somebody made it. Never in a million years would you come to the conclusion that it somehow created itself, or it somehow over time, formed itself into this amazing design that it is. And why not? Because that's unnatural, right? To come to that conclusion. It's common sense that we would say, well, yes, somebody made that. Driving in this morning, there's construction going on everywhere, and some of it's in the middle of it. It's being built. And you can see the process of these homes and these apartments being built. Somebody is designing those. Somebody is building those. And in the same way, we look at the universe, and for whatever reason, people have, over the last couple centuries, come to now accept that, well, maybe this amazing universe that we live in with all its laws and order and design everywhere somehow has created itself. Or we don't know, there was a big bang and it exploded and everything just magically came into order and structure and developed these laws of nature. It's like, maybe you've heard the case of, it'd be like a tornado flying through a junkyard, and afterwards, you'd come out with a 747. It's just not logical, is it? Okay. Steve touched on this a little bit ago. Go back to Romans chapter 1, okay? Because Paul gave us in Romans 1 the case for why we have an understanding of God within us. Well, next, Paul's going to say that God did more than just give us a fundamental conception of Him. He also gave us physical proof everywhere around us. Romans 1 and verse 20. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So since the creation of the world, and notice His invisible attributes and His eternal power. Again, the idea that something that exists outside of time and space, something that is not finite, it's eternal. It's proof that only something that holds those qualities could create everything around us that we see. And the amazing design, it's clearly seen, being understood by what has been made. Paul? Yeah.
The existence of things, say for instance, if we didn't have any kind of mountain, what would we be today? And if we wouldn't have anything that we would have, we wouldn't still be, if we had something to do, we'd still be walking.
True. Yeah, again, something was alive and it existed, right? But before we ate it, it had life. And so where does that life come from? That's the fundamental question. And again, there's proof of it all around us. And so talking about, the animals and the plants and the design that they are, and even in the universe and in our own bodies, there are, did you know, anybody have an understanding or a number, a guess as to how many stars or solar systems are in the universe? Right, it keeps changing because they keep finding more and more and more. We can't even really truly fathom. It's remarkable. How about how many cells are within the the human body, nurses, doctors, how many cells are within the human body? And I only know this because I looked it up. The claim is that there are 37.2 trillion cells within each individual human body. There you go. Yeah. I know we're beginning to become numb to trillions, right? But that's an astronomical number. 37.2 trillion cells contained in the human body. So, again, you think about also the DNA of our bodies and how that is like the roadmap of our being and our existence. And all that's, it's amazing. It's like a computer chip. The human systems within our body. There are 12 systems in the human body, right? The cardiovascular, the skeletal, the muscular, the digestive, the endocrine, excretory, the immune, the hematopoietic. I say that wrong, I'm sure. Yeah, exactly, right? Lymphatic, which transports the fluid in the cells within our body. The central nervous system, the reproductive system, the respiratory, and the sensory. So 12 systems within the human body. And again, incredible design. John, are we out of time? It's time? All right. So we'll leave you with this. Abraham Lincoln said that he has a record of saying many things, again, about God and the Bible. There's a lot of questions about his faith. He was not an atheist, nor even, I think, an agnostic. But he says, I can see how it might be possible for a man to look down upon the earth and be an atheist. But I cannot conceive how he could look up into the heavens and say, there is no God. And again, maybe he's talking about really just looking at the nature of man in and of itself and not necessarily the design of man, but we look at the proof, it's all around us. God has given it to us, and we'll pick up right here next time, and one of those we'll look at is the human eye, and even what Darwin said about the human eye. And then we'll wrap it up with talking about the last argument, which is the moral argument for God. Appreciate your participation.